Story 1. The Kingdom of Axum, an empire of stone and salt. You close your eyes, and I invite you to drift into the Horn of Africa. Not the dusty desert of modern headlines, but a place where hills were once green, stone monuments reached toward the sky, and merchants spoke in dozens of languages as they bartered spices, salt, ivory and gold. This was Axum, a kingdom that emerged over 2,000 years ago in what is today northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. When you hear the word empire, your mind may travel to Rome, Persia or China. Yet Axum, during its height, was counted among the great powers of the ancient world. A Persian chronicler once described the world's 4 dominant kingdoms as Persia, Rome, China and Axum. And yet, if you were to ask the average person in the United States today about Axum, they might never have heard of it. Axum's story begins with geography. The land was not as arid as it is now. Seasonal rains nourished the highlands, and rivers cut through fertile valleys. You can imagine terraced fields carved into slopes, watered by channels carefully maintained to catch every drop of rain. Farmers grew wheat, barley, and teff. The grain still central to Ethiopian cuisine today. In the lowlands, herders kept cattle and goats, their herds providing milk, hides, and wealth. The soil gave, but it demanded effort. Survival depended on irrigation, storage, and a rhythm of labour tied to the seasons. Yet agriculture alone does not explain Axum's rise. The kingdom sat at the crossroads of ancient trade. To the east lay the Red Sea, a watery highway linking Africa to Arabia and India. Ships carried frankincense, myrrh, silk, spices, and gold. Adulis, Axum's principal port, was one of the busiest in the ancient world. Greek-speaking merchants from the Mediterranean rubbed shoulders with Indian traders and African caravan leaders. If you walk the streets of Adulis in the first centuries of the Common Era, you might hear Greek, Ge'ez, Arabic, and even Latin spoken in the same market square. Salt was another pillar of Axum's wealth. Across the desert, caravans carried blocks of salt carved neatly into rectangular slabs. To the people of Axum, salt was not only food, it was currency. It could be traded, stored, and measured. Even today, in parts of Ethiopia, salt blocks remain a medium of exchange, echoing the past. The rulers of Axum understood the value of trade and stability. Unlike kingdoms that thrived briefly on conquest and collapsed, Axum built systems to sustain itself. Roads linked the highland capital to the port at Adulis. Wells and storage pits supported caravans. Customs houses collected taxes on goods entering and leaving. The bureaucracy may not sound exciting, but it was the scaffolding on which an empire stood. The kings of Axum left their mark in stone. Towering obelisks carved from single pieces of granite still rise above the land today. The tallest once stood over 30 metres before. It toppled centuries ago. These stelae were not tombs in the Egyptian sense, but markers of authority, meant to impress and endure. Each one had windows and doors carved into its surface, mimicking houses of the living, reminders that the rulers of Axum carried their power beyond death. Imagine workers hauling these massive stones across uneven ground, aligning them with precision, raising them upright with ropes and sheer human effort. These monuments were not built quickly, nor for immediate use. They were built to outlast generations, to remind those who came after that here was a kingdom of permanence. One of the most fascinating aspects of Axum was its coinage. Beginning in the 3rd century CE, Axum became the first African state outside of the Mediterranean to mint its own coins. Gold, silver and bronze coins bore the faces of kings, inscriptions in Greek, and later in Ge'ez, the local language. To hold an Axumite coin was to hold proof of a kingdom that saw itself as part of the wider world. The coins were not just for local use, they circulated in trade networks stretching from India to Byzantium. On one side you might find a king's portrait, on the other, a cross or a disc and crescent, reflecting the shift in religion over time. Religion too shaped Axum's destiny. In the early centuries, Axum's people practiced a polytheistic faith, worshipping gods tied to the natural world. But by the 4th century under King Ezana, Axum embraced Christianity, becoming one of the first states in the world to adopt the faith officially. This was centuries before much of Europe had done the same. Imagine the moment. A kingdom at the edge of the Red Sea declaring allegiance to a faith still spreading across the Roman Empire. Christianity in Aksum developed its own character, woven with local traditions, expressed in ge'ez and anchored in churches carved out of stone. As you drift further into thought, you might picture daily life in Aksum. Farmers rising with the sun to tend their crops, merchants balancing ledgers, carefully noting shipments of ivory or gold, caravans trudging across dusty plains, donkeys laden with salt, children gathering water in clay jars, women weaving textiles, priests chanting in ge'ez within stone churches cooled by shadows. Aksum was not only a kingdom of monuments and kings, it was a society of people whose small routines, repeated across centuries, sustained the empire's greatness. Yet for all its strength, Aksum faced challenges. The very trade routes that made it rich also made it vulnerable. Control of the Red Sea shifted as empires rose and fell. When Persian merchants gained dominance, Aksum's influence waned. The climate too began to change. Rainfall declined, soils eroded, and harvests faltered. A kingdom built on both stone and salt found itself tested by forces beyond human control. Still, in this first glimpse of Aksum, what stands out is not its decline but its rise. Few Americans learned that Ethiopia was home to one of the world's great ancient powers. They may have heard of Egypt or Carthage, but not of Aksum, the empire of stone obelisks, salt caravans, and coins that travelled across oceans. And so the question lingers: how did this kingdom, once named among the world's greatest, begin to fade from memory, its obelisks silent witnesses to centuries of change? When you think of empires, it is easy to imagine armies marching and borders expanding through conquest. But in Aksum, expansion was as much about influence as it was about territory. The kingdom's strength came not only from its spears and shields, but also from its ability to control trade, forge alliances, and present itself as indispensable to the flow of goods and ideas across continents. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, Aksum stood at the height of its power. Its rulers presided over a realm that stretched across the Ethiopian highlands, down into Eritrea, and at times into Yemen across the Red Sea. This was no small feat. To control both sides of the Red Sea meant that Aksum dominated one of the most important maritime corridors of the ancient world. The narrow strait of Bab el-Mandeb, where Africa and Arabia almost touch, became a gateway Aksum could guard or open. Aksum's expansion into Arabia was not simply conquest for its own sake. Arabia offered frankincense and myrrh, resins used in religious rituals across the Mediterranean and Asia. For centuries, demand for these aromatics fueled Arabian wealth, and Aksum's control of the southern Arabian kingdoms meant it could insert itself into this lucrative trade. Inscriptions carved into stone in Yemen still bear witness to Aksumite kings who claimed victory across the sea. Their armies, moving by ship, carried war elephants and cavalry, symbols of wealth and strength. But beyond conquest, Aksum's real power lay in its role as a middleman of global commerce. Imagine standing at the port of Adulis during its peak. The air would smell of spices, resin, and salt carried by the wind. Ships with triangular lateen sails bobbed in the harbour, their hulls creaking as cargo was unloaded. Traders from India would bring textiles, pearls, and spices. Merchants from the Roman world brought wine, glassware, and precious metals. From Africa's interior came ivory, gold, and exotic animals, giraffes, rhinoceroses, and even elephants that astonished foreign courts. Roman writers knew of Aksum well. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek merchant's handbook from the 1st century CE, described Adulis as a bustling centre, where ivory and slaves were traded in large quantities. Later, Roman coins have been found buried in Ethiopian soil, silent evidence of exchanges that once spanned seas. For Aksum, Rome was not a distant superpower, it was a trading partner, one that relied on African goods for luxury markets. Coinage reinforced this network. Aksumite coins, with their gold and silver purity, gained respect abroad. On one side, the king's profile projected authority. On the other, Christian symbols like the cross gradually replaced older sun and moon emblems. These coins were not only money but also messages. A merchant receiving one in a distant market was reminded of the authority of Aksum's kings and the kingdom's role in the web of trade. Religion became another tool of influence. When King Ezana converted to Christianity in the 4th century, Aksum took on a new identity. While the Roman Empire in the west and the Byzantine Empire in the east wrestled with theological disputes, Aksum stood as one of the earliest Christian kingdoms. missionaries, bishops, and scholars connected Aksum to Alexandria in Egypt, one of the intellectual centres of the faith. Christianity provided not only spiritual meaning but also diplomatic strength. By sharing the religion of the Byzantine emperors, Aksum secured alliances that crossed seas. At the same time, Aksum's Christianity developed a unique flavour. Services were conducted in Ge'ez, the written language that flourished in Aksum and still survives in Ethiopia's liturgy today. Churches were carved into rock, shaped not by Roman basilica designs but by local traditions. Christianity in Aksum was African in expression, blending new theology with old customs. This gave the kingdom cohesion, a sense of identity that outlasted the rise and fall of trade routes. Cultural expansion also unfolded quietly. Inscriptions in Ge'ez, Greek and Sabaean, the language of South Arabia, show how multilingual Aksumite society was. To administer trade, diplomacy and religion, scribes had to shift between scripts and tongues. This multilingualism reflected a cosmopolitan world where identities overlapped. A caravan leader might pray in one language, bargain in another, and carve his legacy in stone with a third. If you pause to consider daily life during Aksum's height, the rhythms of empire would filter down into ordinary routines. Farmers might deliver surplus grain as tax to the king's storehouses. Craftsmen worked ivory into delicate carvings, some of which travelled as far as India or Rome. Fishermen cast nets into the Red Sea, catching food to feed sailors and merchants. Children may have grown up seeing foreign traders pass through their towns, their clothes and accents different but increasingly familiar. For these people, empire was not abstract. It was the daily arrival of goods, the coin in their palm, the distant authority of a king whose face they recognised on gold. Diplomatically, Aksum had a presence far beyond its immediate borders. Byzantine records mention embassies from Aksum arriving in Constantinople. Imagine the scene: African envoys dressed in fine textiles, bringing gifts of ivory or exotic animals standing before the Byzantine emperor. Their presence was a reminder that power was not confined to Europe or Asia, that across the sea another kingdom commanded respect. Aksum's reputation reached even further. Indian and Chinese sources contain traces of knowledge about this African kingdom. Though fragmentary, these mentions show that Aksum was part of the same global conversation that linked empires thousands of miles apart. Few Americans today might imagine Ethiopia as once having a global voice, but in antiquity, it did. Yet influence is always fragile. Even as Aksum reached its height, challenges loomed. Trade routes could shift suddenly. A single war in Arabia might close ports. A single political change in Rome or Persia might reduce demand for African goods. The kingdom's power rested on connections across oceans, and those connections were vulnerable. Still, for centuries Aksum held its place. Its kings issued coins, built monuments, and declared their victories in inscriptions. Its farmers sustained the economy, its traders kept the markets alive, and its priests wove a religious fabric that held society together. The empire expanded not just by the sword, but by salt, stone, and scripture. As you drift deeper into the quiet history of Aksum, consider the paradox. Here was a kingdom that influenced the ancient world, stood among its greatest powers, and yet is barely taught in classrooms today. Its ships once controlled seas, its coins crossed continents, and its voice was heard in imperial courts from Byzantium to India. And yet, one must ask, if Aksum was once counted among the great empires, how did it begin to fade? What forces slowly unravelled its hold over trade, faith and influence, until it was remembered only in stone ruins and fragments of text? Empires rarely end with a single battle or dramatic collapse. More often they fade slowly, undone not by one enemy, but by a web of pressures, economic, environmental and political, that over time unravel the threads holding them together. The kingdom of Aksum, so dominant in trade and influence for centuries, followed this quieter pattern of decline. Its fall was not a single moment of defeat, but a long retreat, step by step, until what was once an empire became memory. The first signs of weakness emerged in the 6th and 7th centuries CE. For generations, Aksum had thrived on its control of Red Sea trade. Ships sailed from Adulis, carrying goods that linked Africa, Arabia, India, and Byzantium. But trade is never static. When the Persian Empire gained dominance over much of the Near East, Aksum's influence in Arabian ports began to wane. Then, with the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the balance shifted even more dramatically. The early Islamic caliphates quickly gained control of the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea coast. This new power structure meant that Aksum was cut off from its most vital sea lanes. Though Muslim leaders had no initial hostility toward Aksum, the Prophet Muhammad himself is said to have praised the Christian king of Aksum, who gave refuge to his followers during their early persecution in Mecca. The geopolitical landscape changed. Trade that once flowed through Adulis now diverted to Muslim-controlled ports. Without the lifeblood of international trade, Aksum's economy contracted. The caravans carrying salt and ivory still moved, but the volume diminished. Foreign merchants no longer filled the markets in the same numbers. Coins, once minted in gold and silver, dwindled to crude bronze, reflecting shrinking resources. This decline in coinage, so stark in the archaeological record, is a silent measure of how the empire's prosperity ebbed away. The environment, too, played its part. The Ethiopian highlands, while fertile, depend on regular rainfall. Beginning around the 6th century, evidence suggests shifts in climate, reduced rainfall, soil erosion, and the silting of rivers. For a kingdom already weakened by trade losses, crop failures would have strained its population further. Hillsides once terraced for grain may have turned barren. Families who once sold surplus to the markets now struggled to feed themselves. As the external and environmental pressures grew, Aksum's political centre of gravity began to shift. The old capital, once near the great steely fields and monumental architecture, gradually lost prominence. Power moved further into the Ethiopian highlands, away from the vulnerable Red Sea coast. This shift is telling. It shows how rulers sought safety inland, choosing isolation over exposure to the trade routes that once made them rich. Aksum did not vanish. It transformed, contracting into a kingdom less visible to the outside world. The religious identity of Aksum, however, endured. Christianity remained a unifying force even as the empire shrank. Churches carved into rock, hidden in the highlands, became sanctuaries not only of worship but of cultural survival. The Ge'ez language, fostered in Aksum, persisted as the liturgical tongue of Ethiopian Christianity. In fact, while the empire itself faded, the church became the carrier of its memory, preserving stories, liturgy, and continuity long after the monuments were silent. Foreign travellers who glimpsed Ethiopia in the Middle Ages sometimes carried home strange tales. In Europe, stories spread of a mysterious Christian king ruling somewhere in the east, known as Prester John. These legends, though fantastical, may have been faint echoes of Aksum's Christian heritage, distorted by distance and imagination. The reality was less dramatic, but no less remarkable. A Christian kingdom had survived for centuries in Africa, quietly holding on to its faith while empires around it rose and fell. Archaeological remains speak where written sources fall silent. The broken obelisks, the ruins of palaces, the weathered inscriptions, they tell of a kingdom that once commanded wealth and power. The coins unearthed in India or found in Mediterranean hoards remind us that Aksum was part of the global economy, even if it has been forgotten in many modern histories. Each artifact is like a fragment of a dream, evidence of a world that once existed but now requires careful reconstruction. The legacy of Aksum lives on most clearly in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, tracing its roots to King Ezana's conversion, remains one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world. Its liturgy, chants, and festivals carry rhythms that began in Aksumite times. The script of Ge'ez, once carved on stone stele and minted on coins, is still used in religious texts. Even the memory of Aksumite kings, Ezana, Caleb, and others, survives in Ethiopian chronicles, where they are remembered as guardians of the faith. There is also a deeper legacy. Aksum challenges the narrow view of world history that often sidelines Africa. It reminds us that Africa was not isolated, not a passive backdrop to events elsewhere, but an active participant in shaping global exchange. While Rome and Byzantium debated politics and faith, Aksum was trading ivory and gold, building churches and minting coins. To include Aksum in the narrative is to recognize that the ancient world was more interconnected than schoolbooks sometimes suggest. For Americans today, the ruins of Aksum may feel distant, yet they speak to universal questions. How does a society adapt when trade routes shift? How do people preserve culture when economic foundations crumble? And how do civilizations balance openness to the wider world with the need to retreat and survive in isolation? Axum faced all of these questions, and its answers shaped not only its survival, but also the legacy that carried into modern Ethiopia. The obelisks still stand, tall against the sky, their carved windows and doors marking the memory of a kingdom. They are silent, but they speak of a people who believed in permanence, even as their empire slowly unravelled. To walk among them today is to feel the weight of time, the persistence of stone, and the fragility of power. And so, as you reflect on Axum's story, another question lingers. If a kingdom so influential could fade into obscurity, how many other forgotten empires lie buried under the soil of Africa, waiting to be remembered? Story 2. The Nok Civilization, the ironworking people of terracotta. When you imagine ancient civilizations, your mind may go to stone pyramids, marble temples, or cities carved into cliffs. But in the heart of what is now central Nigeria, the people of Nok left behind something far more fragile. Terracotta figures, fired clay shaped into human faces, animals and spirits. Unlike the great stone obelisks of Axum, the legacy of Nok is brittle, easily broken, and often found in fragments. And yet, these fragments tell us of one of Africa's earliest complex societies, one that mastered iron long before many of its neighbours. The Nok culture flourished roughly between 1000 BCE and 300 CE. That is over 1,000 years of existence, making it one of the longest-lived early African societies. It occupied a stretch of savanna and forest in what is today Kaduna, Plateau, and Nasarawa states of Nigeria. If you picture the landscape, imagine rolling plateaus broken by patches of woodland, with rivers cutting through fertile valleys. The rains arrived in long seasons, feeding crops of millet, sorghum, and yam. Between the rains, the dry season stretched on, and survival meant knowing how to store grain, dig wells, and use the land carefully. The Nok people did not leave written records. There are no inscriptions or chronicles to explain who they were or how they lived. Instead, archaeologists piece together their story from what has been dug from the earth. Pottery shards, iron tools, furnaces, and above all terracotta sculptures. This absence of written words makes Nok both fascinating and frustrating. It means that much of what we know is conjecture, reconstructed from broken artifacts. But it also means that the Nok story is one of silence, an ancient culture speaking to us only through clay and iron. Iron was Nok's defining achievement. By at least the 6th century BCE, and possibly earlier, Nok people were smelting iron in furnaces. This was remarkable. Iron smelting is a complex process, requiring controlled heat, charcoal, and a deep knowledge of how ores behave under fire. While much of the Mediterranean still relied on bronze, Nok smiths were shaping iron into tools and weapons. This gave them an advantage in farming. Iron hoes, sickles, and axes made it easier to clear land and grow crops. It also changed warfare, for iron-tipped spears and arrows cut deeper than stone or wood. Ironworking did more than make Nok efficient. It tied them into broader networks. Charcoal had to be gathered, furnaces built, ores mined. Each step required organisation. It is likely that specialist smiths arose, respected, or perhaps feared, for their knowledge of fire and metal. In many African societies, blacksmiths held a unique place, sometimes treated as ritual figures because their work bridged earth and fire, raw ore and living tool. Whether Nok smiths saw themselves this way, we do not know. But it is not hard to imagine a forge glowing in the night, sparks flying as hammers shaped red-hot iron, the community watching with awe. And yet, despite the iron, what the Nok left behind most vividly is clay. Terracotta sculptures of human heads, often life-sized, with elaborate hairstyles, scarification marks, and wide triangular eyes. Some are realistic, others stylized, almost abstract. Many were broken deliberately, perhaps as part of rituals. Others survived by accident, buried in soil until modern farmers unearthed them while ploughing fields. Today they sit in museum cases, their features staring back with expressions frozen for 2 millennia. What did these figures mean to the Nok people? Scholars debate. Some may have been ancestor figures, meant to connect the living to the dead. Others might have been protective, placed in fields or homes to guard against misfortune. The detailed hairstyles suggest they also captured elements of daily life, preserving fashions and identities otherwise lost. In their silence, they ask us to guess at rituals and beliefs we cannot fully reconstruct. Daily life in Nok would not have been dominated only by art or metallurgy. Most people farmed. Families planted millet and sorghum, crops hardy enough to endure the climate's swings. Goats and cattle grazed the grasslands, providing milk and meat. Hunting supplemented diets, with antelope and smaller game common in the savannas. Pottery shards suggest cooking vessels and storage jars, some simple, others decorated. Each household likely made and used clay daily, even as a few artists produced the more striking terracotta figures. Villages may have been small, clusters of round huts with thatched roofs, surrounded by fields. In some areas, settlement mounds have been identified, evidence of long-term habitation. The rhythm of life followed the seasons, planting with the rains, harvesting under the sun, storing food for the lean months. Iron tools made the work easier, but survival still required cooperation. Neighbours sharing labour, families pooling resources, elders passing down knowledge of when to sow and when to reap. Nok's location also placed it on natural corridors of movement. Trade routes snaked across West Africa, linking forest products from the south with savanna goods to the north. Ivory, cola nuts, and perhaps even slaves may have moved through Nok territory. In exchange, Nok could have offered iron tools, terracotta figures, or food surpluses. We do not have written records of these exchanges, but the logic of geography suggests Nok was not isolated. No society that smelted iron and produced art of such refinement existed in a vacuum. The mystery of Nok is sharpened by how little of it survives intact. Unlike Egypt with its pyramids, or Aksum with its obelisks, Nok left no monumental stone architecture. Their homes were built from mud and wood, which decayed long ago. Their forges collapsed into mounds of slag and ash. What we know comes from the fragments that happened to endure. Broken pottery, shattered statues, corroded iron. In this sense, Nok is a reminder of how fragile history is. Entire civilizations can last for 1,000 years, and yet vanish almost entirely if their works are not preserved in durable stone. For Americans today, the Nok civilization is virtually unknown. Ask the average person about African history before European colonization, and they might mention Egypt or perhaps Mali. But Nok, with its 1,000-year span and pioneering iron smelting, is often absent from textbooks. Its art may be admired in museum collections, but its story rarely enters the larger narrative of world history. Still, the fragments speak. Each terracotta face, with its hollow eyes and faintly enigmatic expression, seems to ask us, who made me and why? Was I a god, an ancestor, a protector? Was I broken in ritual or shattered by time? These questions linger, unresolved, because the Nok left no words to guide us. And so the story of Nok begins not with certainty but with wonder. How a people so early mastered iron, how they created art that still stirs us, and how they lived for centuries in a land of savanna and plateau. The question that remains is, how did this long-lasting civilization, with such remarkable skills, eventually disappear into silence, leaving behind only broken clay and rusted iron? To understand the Nok civilization, you must set aside the expectation of empires ruled by kings in palaces or cities with stone walls. Nok was not an empire in the sense of Rome or Aksum. It was a network of farming villages, iron smelting centres, and artistic communities that shared traditions over a wide region. Its strength lay not in monumental architecture, but in the continuity of its culture across centuries. The iron furnaces of Nok tell us much about their society. Archaeologists have uncovered circular furnaces built from clay, their walls hardened by the heat of countless smelting fires. Inside, charcoal and iron ore were layered, then lit to burn for hours. Through small tuyeres, clay pipes, air was blown into the fire, sometimes with the help of skin bellows, raising temperatures high enough to reduce ore into usable iron bloom. The process was laborious. A furnace might yield only a few kilograms of iron after days of tending. But that iron was transformative. The very act of producing iron suggests social organization. Gathering wood for charcoal required planning, as did mining ore. Smelting was dangerous, with intense heat and sparks flying. Smiths needed apprentices, helpers, and protection. Iron was precious, and so were the people who knew how to make it. In many African traditions, blacksmiths were treated with ambivalence, respected for their skills, sometimes feared for their association with fire and transformation. It is likely that knocksmiths occupied a similar role, figures of both utility and mystery within their villages. What did the knock make with their iron? Archaeological finds include arrowheads, spear points, knives and farming tools. An iron hoe could double the efficiency of clearing land compared to stone. Iron spearheads gave hunters and warriors an edge. With each tool, knock communities extended their reach. More land farmed, more food produced, more security against neighbours or predators. Iron may also have shaped knock's trade. A surplus of tools could be exchanged with neighbouring peoples, spreading knock influence beyond its immediate homeland. The terracotta figures add another layer to our understanding. They were not casual decorations. The effort required to gather clay, mould it, and fire it in kilns shows intention. The figures vary in size, from small fragments to statues nearly life-size. Many depict human heads with elongated features, pierced pupils, and elaborate hairstyles. Others show entire figures, seated men and women, sometimes with jewellery or ornaments. Still others depict animals, elephants, monkeys, snakes, perhaps tied to beliefs or myths. Some statues appear broken deliberately. This has led scholars to suggest they played a role in rituals. Perhaps they were offerings, shattered at the end of ceremonies to release their power. Others may have been buried intentionally, placed in fields to ensure fertility, or interred with the dead as guardians. Without written texts, these are interpretations. But the consistency of style across a wide area shows shared cultural values. The knock people, spread across villages, participated in rituals that united them in belief. The hairstyles carved in clay are especially striking. Some figures show complex braids and buns carefully arranged. These are not abstract symbols, but reflections of real fashion, preserved in fired clay long after hair and skin disappeared. They remind us that culture is carried not only in tools and rituals, but in the intimate details of personal identity. How one wears the hair, marks the skin, or decorates the body. These details, frozen in terracotta, humanize the knock, bridging the gap of 2,000 years. Knock society likely revolved around kinship groups and elders. Villages would have been governed not by kings, but by councils of senior men and women who made decisions about land, harvests, and disputes. Oral tradition, though lost to us, would have carried stories, laws, and collective memory. Children grew up learning farming, craft, and ritual through apprenticeship and observation. The rhythm of life was communal, woven around the seasons and sustained by cooperation. Yet knock was not isolated. Its position in central Nigeria placed it between ecological zones, the savanna to the north and the forest to the south. This gave it access to diverse resources. From the savanna came grazing lands, game, and access to northern trade. From the forests came wood, clay, and perhaps exotic products like kola nuts. Knock's iron tools may have moved outward along these routes, while goods from other regions flowed inward. The terracotta art also hints at long-distance influence. Some knock figures resemble later styles in West Africa, such as those of the Yoruba in Ife and the Benin Kingdom. While separated by centuries, the continuity of naturalistic human depiction suggests knock may have set cultural precedents that echoed into later African art. It is not that Ife or Benin copied knock directly, but that traditions of valuing human likeness, ritual terracotta, and artistic symbolism had deep roots reaching back to knock. The people themselves lived lives that were ordinary yet enduring. A day might begin with women pounding grain, the steady rhythm of pestles echoing through the village. Men might tend goats, clear fields, or repair tools. Children carried water in clay pots, herded small animals, or sat with elders learning songs and stories. The forge, when active, would glow at night, its fire a beacon against the dark. Rituals, perhaps to honour ancestors, ask for rain, or mark seasonal changes, punctuated the year. In these rhythms, knock life was not exotic but human, recognisable even across millennia. One of the striking things about knock is the sheer length of its continuity. For over 1,000 years, knock communities produced terracotta and smelted iron. This endurance suggests stability, systems of farming, trade, and culture strong enough to last across many generations. Few societies in the world maintain such consistency without leaving written records. And yet, Nok did. The silence of their words is balanced by the persistence of their practices. Still, fragility lingered. Nok art and iron give the impression of permanence, but their materials were vulnerable. Clay shatters, iron rusts, wood decays. What remains is only a fraction of what once was. The terracotta we admire today survived largely by accident, buried in soil until unearthed by farmers or archaeologists. The villages themselves eroded back into the landscape. Even the iron furnaces collapsed into indistinct mounds. Without deliberate preservation, history can vanish almost entirely, leaving only broken hints. And so, the Nok people remind us of the precariousness of memory. Their society shaped West Africa, pioneered iron smelting, and left art of extraordinary beauty. Yet without texts, much of their world is invisible. We see fragments but not the full picture. We reconstruct their culture from shards, always aware that the story we tell may be partial. Still, in that partial story lies richness. Nok's culture was not static. It changed over centuries, adapting to shifting climates, trade, and population. The early Nok may have lived in smaller, scattered villages, while later Nok communities grew larger, with more organised production of iron and terracotta. Rituals may have evolved, art styles shifted, and beliefs transformed. A civilization that lasted a millennium could not have remained the same throughout. It must have changed, even if those changes are lost to us. As you let the story settle, you might think of the Nok civilization as a shadow, its outlines visible, its details blurred. We know its iron glowed in furnaces, its clay figures stared with hollow eyes, its people lived and farmed on the Nigerian plateau. We know it lasted for centuries. But then, somewhere around 300 CE, it faded. The forges cooled, the terracotta stopped, and the silence deepened. The lingering question is, what happened to Nok? Did climate shifts, resource exhaustion, or migration unravel it? Or did its people simply merge into later cultures, their traditions carried on under new names? By the 3rd century of our era, something shifted on the Nigerian plateau. The fires of the furnaces grew fewer, the terracotta figures ceased to be moulded, and the distinctive signature of the Nok faded into silence. Archaeologists tracing layers of soil find the gap, evidence of iron production and terracotta in the centuries before 300 CE, and then sudden absence. The question of why remains one of the enduring mysteries of African archaeology. One theory looks to the climate. The Nok civilization thrived in a region that lay between forest and savanna. This was an advantage during stable periods, giving access to varied resources. But climates are not fixed. Around the time of Nok's decline, parts of West Africa experienced episodes of drought and environmental stress. Less rain meant poorer harvests. Forest belts shifted, grasslands encroached. For a farming people, even small shifts could mean famine, migration, and the abandonment of old centres. Another explanation lies in the soil itself. Nok depended heavily on charcoal for its iron furnaces. To smelt ore, large amounts of wood had to be cut, burned, and converted to charcoal. Over centuries, this could strip the land of trees. Deforestation might have reduced rainfall, eroded soils, and made farming harder. The very technology that sustained Nok may have undermined its long-term survival. The furnaces that once glowed with promise may have contributed to ecological strain. Conflict is also possible. Archaeological hints suggest that Nok lived in a world of neighbouring cultures. As iron spread, so did competition. Iron weapons gave advantage in hunting, but also in warfare. If rival groups gained strength, Nok communities may have faced raids, displacement, or assimilation. Unlike later centralised kingdoms, Nok lacked fortified cities or standing armies. A loosely linked network of villages, however culturally rich, may have been vulnerable to disruption. Yet the disappearance of Nok is not the same as destruction. More likely, Nok people continued to live, farm, and adapt, only under new cultural names. Archaeologists note continuity between Nok and later groups in Nigeria, such as the Yoruba and other forest-dwelling peoples. The terracotta tradition, though transformed, reappears centuries later in the astonishingly naturalistic sculptures of If, The technological knowledge of iron clearly persisted, for ironworking spread widely through West Africa in the centuries after Nok's decline. What vanished was not the people themselves, but the distinct cultural markers we call Nok. This raises an important point about how we interpret history. To us, the end of terracotta production looks like a disappearance. But to those who lived it, it may have been a slow change of practice, a shift in priorities. Perhaps communities moved into denser forests, abandoning large terracotta figures for perishable wooden carvings. Perhaps ritual changed, and new forms of expression emerged. Archaeology registers absence, human life continued. What remains undeniable is Nok's role as a pioneer. To master iron so early, and to sustain that mastery for a millennium, set a foundation for later West African societies. By the time kingdoms like Ghana, Mali and Benin rose, iron was an established technology, and artistic traditions had deep roots. Nok was not forgotten in its own time, only in ours. The rediscovery of Nok in the 20th century reshaped how scholars viewed African history. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, European scholars dismissed the idea of advanced ancient African civilizations outside of Egypt or Ethiopia. The assumption was that Africa's interior had no early art or technology of note. The discovery of Nok shattered that prejudice. Here were terracotta sculptures older than much of European classical art, and iron smelting contemporary with the earliest in the world. Yet even this rediscovery was partial and fragile. Many Nok artifacts were unearthed not through careful excavation, but through tin mining, which disturbed ancient sites. Farmers, too, digging fields, stumbled upon figures that ended up on art markets. Today, many Nok sculptures sit in museums in Europe or in private collections, often separated from their archaeological context. Each figure, removed from the soil without record, represents a story lost, a clue to Nok's life gone forever. Still, what survives offers extraordinary windows into the past. The hollow eyes of a Nok terracotta stare at us across 2 millennia. The iron smelting furnaces, now collapsed, whisper of flames once carefully tended. The soils, dark with traces of ancient charcoal, bear witness to centuries of work. In these fragments, the Nok continue to speak, though faintly. For you, the listener, there is something humbling about this story. Nok was not a grand empire. It did not build stone pyramids or leave written chronicles. It lived in clay and fire, in villages and fields, in hairstyles and rituals. Its greatness lay in the ordinary endurance of a people who sustained a culture for 1,000 years. And though their names are forgotten, their work is not. When you think of Nok, imagine a small village at dusk. The forge glows, its heat flickering against clay huts. Women grind grain, children carry water, elders tell stories by the fire. Terracotta figure sits nearby, freshly fired, its eyes still sharp, waiting to be placed in the earth as part of a ritual. This was Nok, not a vanished mystery, but a living, breathing world. And yet we must return to the silence. Around the year 300 CE, that forge goes dark. The terracotta figure remains unfinished, its clay never hardened by fire. The songs of the elders fall quiet. Nok, as we know it, ends. What remains is a question. Did Nok truly disappear? Or does it still live on in the unseen continuities of West African culture? Its iron, its art, its memory carried quietly forward into new names and new peoples. Story 3. The Kingdom of Aksum, the forgotten empire of trade and faith. If you trace your mind's eye along the eastern edge of Africa, where the highlands of Ethiopia meet the waters of the Red Sea, you will arrive at the ancient home of Aksum. Unlike the Nok, who thrived in the heart of the continent, Aksum was a kingdom of horizons. Its gaze stretched outward, across seas and deserts, into the web of trade that bound together Rome, India, and Arabia. In the first centuries of our era, Aksum was counted among the world's great powers. Its name appears in Roman and Persian lists of mighty kingdoms, alongside China, India, and Rome itself. But Aksum's story begins earlier, in the highlands of northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Here, fertile soils, watered by seasonal rains, supported agriculture for millennia. Farmers grew teff, wheat, and barley, and herders grazed cattle and sheep on the plateaus. This environment allowed for surpluses, and surpluses allowed for towns. By the 1st century BCE, settlements were growing into centres of exchange. The kingdom of Aksum emerged from these roots, rising to prominence around the turn of the first millennium CE. Its position was extraordinary. To the east, the Red Sea provided access to maritime routes. Ships sailed north to Egypt and the Mediterranean, south to Arabia and India. To the west, caravan routes connected Aksum to the Nile Valley and beyond. To the south lay the interior of Africa, rich in ivory, gold, and slaves. Aksum sat at a crossroads, perfectly placed to profit from movement in every direction. Archaeology tells us that Aksumite kings understood this advantage. They minted coins, one of the earliest African societies outside the Mediterranean to do so. These coins bore inscriptions in Ge'ez, the written language of Aksum, and depicted royal faces, crosses, and ears of grain. They were struck in gold, silver, and bronze and circulated widely, found as far afield as India. Coinage made trade easier, but it also proclaimed legitimacy. Only great kingdoms put their authority into metal. Trade goods flowed through Aksum's ports. From Africa came ivory, prized in Rome for luxury carvings and furniture, rhinoceros horn, valued in India and China, tortoiseshell, used for inlay, gold, mined inland, and slaves, sold across the ancient world. In return, merchants brought textiles, glassware, wine, olive oil, and spices. Aksum's markets thrived on this exchange, feeding the wealth of its rulers. One of the main ports was Adulis, located on the Red Sea coast. Greek and Roman writers mention Adulis as a bustling hub. Ships would anchor there after crossing from Egypt or Arabia, and caravans would carry goods up into the highlands of Aksum. Imagine the scene: sailors unloading amphorae of wine, ivory tusks stacked on quays, camels kneeling with heavy packs, and translators switching between Greek, Ge'ez, and Arabic. Adulis was not just a port, but a gateway between worlds. The Elayya architecture of Aksum also testifies to its grandeur. The most famous remains are the stelae, towering stone obelisks, some over 30 metres tall, carved from single blocks of granite. These stelae were erected over underground tombs, marking the graves of kings and nobles. Their faces are decorated with false windows and doors, as though the stone were a many-storied building. No mortar was used. The stones were cut and fitted with precision. To raise such monoliths required extraordinary engineering and labour. The stelae stood as symbols of power, visible across the plateau, linking the rulers of Aksum with permanence and the heavens above. Religion, too, was central to early Aksumite life. Before Christianity, Aksumites worshipped a pantheon of deities tied to the natural world, with altars and sacrifices made in open-air temples. Some inscriptions mention gods like Marem, considered a patron of kings. Rulers claimed divine descent, intertwining politics with sacred authority. Rituals likely involved animal sacrifice, feasting, and processions, practices not unlike those of other ancient cultures. But what gave Aksum its edge was its adaptability. The kingdom did not exist in isolation, but engaged constantly with neighbours. From Arabia, across the narrow Red Sea, came influences in language, script, and culture. In fact, some of the earliest writing in Ethiopia used a script related to South Arabian alphabets, before evolving into Ge'ez. The flow of ideas was as steady as the flow of goods. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, Aksum's reputation reached far. A Greek text known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written by a merchant around the mid-1st century CE, describes the Red Sea trade in detail. It mentions Adulis as a centre of ivory trade, and notes the strength of the Aksumite kingdom inland. Roman authors also recorded embassies from Aksum to the Mediterranean world, praising the kingdom's wealth. To appear in the records of Rome was no small feat. It placed Aksum among the recognised powers of the time. The growth of Aksum was not without strain. Its wealth depended on controlling trade routes, but those routes were contested. Arabian kingdoms, Persian merchants, and even nomadic groups along caravan paths could disrupt the flow. To maintain dominance, Aksumite rulers sometimes launched military campaigns. Inscriptions boast of victories over neighbouring peoples, the collection of tribute, and the expansion of influence. Warfare, like trade, was part of the machinery of power. Daily life in Aksum was shaped by this prosperity. Farmers tilled terraced fields on the highlands, storing grain in pits lined with stone. Herds grazed in valleys. Craftsmen worked ivory, gold, and bronze into ornaments and tools. In towns, markets bustled with exchange. Families lived in houses of stone and wood, sometimes multi-storied with flat roofs and small windows. Inscriptions suggest a society stratified between nobles, commoners, slaves, and foreigners, yet bound together by the shared rhythm of agriculture, trade, and ritual. Even amid its wealth, Axum was not a static kingdom. It was a place of constant negotiation between past and future, tradition and change. Its rulers balanced local customs with foreign connections, sacred authority with economic power. This balance allowed Axum to thrive, but it also made the kingdom sensitive to shifts in global networks. Axum's strength lay in being part of the world. Its fate would be tied to the world's changes as well. For now, in this first chapter of its story, Axum stood tall. Its stelae rose against the sky, its coins crossed seas, its markets rang with voices in many tongues. In the words of a later Byzantine ambassador, Axum was counted among the 4 great kingdoms of the world. And yet, as you settle into this history, one question lingers. How did a kingdom so powerful, so renowned in its own time, slip almost entirely from memory in ours? By the 4th century CE, the kingdom of Axum was more than a regional trade power. It was a cultural force that stood at the crossroads of Africa, Arabia, and the wider Mediterranean. Its ships still sailed from Adulis, carrying ivory and gold. Its caravans still wound down the highlands with loads of grain and hides. But something new was stirring within the kingdom, something that would alter its identity forever. This transformation came in the form of religion, the conversion of Axum to Christianity. Unlike many societies where faith spread slowly from the margins, Axum's conversion began at the very heart of power, within the royal household. The story, preserved in both Ethiopian tradition and Greco-Roman records, centers on a man named Frumentius. According to legend, Frumentius was a Christian from Tyre who, along with a companion named Adesius, was captured in the Red Sea region as a boy and brought to Axum. Over time, he rose within the royal court, gaining influence as a tutor to the young prince Ezana. When Ezana ascended to the throne, Frumentius remained at his side. Later, Frumentius travelled to Alexandria, where he was consecrated as a bishop by the patriarch Athanasius. Returning to Axum, he became the kingdom's first Christian bishop. Whether the details are legend or history, the broader truth is clear. Christianity took root at the very top of Axumite society. Under King Ezana, sometime around 330 CE, Axum became one of the first great powers to adopt Christianity as a state religion, contemporary with Constantine's Roman Empire. Coins from Ezana's reign show the shift clearly. Early issues depict a crescent and disc, symbols of older deities, but later coins bear the cross, marking the new faith in metal. This conversion did not erase older traditions overnight. Archaeology suggests continuity of practices for some time. Sacrifices and rituals to pre-Christian gods may have persisted in rural areas, even as churches were built, in towns. But the king's support gave Christianity extraordinary legitimacy. Axumite rulers styled themselves as Christian monarchs, protectors of the faith, linking their power to divine authority. The adoption of Christianity reshaped Axum's position in the world. The kingdom now shared a religion with the Roman and Byzantine empires, strengthening diplomatic ties. Letters from Byzantine emperors mention contact with Axumite rulers, treating them as equals in the global order. At the same time, Christianity deepened Axum's distinction from its Arabian neighbours, who followed different religious traditions. Ezana's reign was also marked by military expansion. Inscriptions record campaigns against the Beja in the north and against peoples to the west. One famous stele, written in Ge'ez, Greek and Sabaean, describes Ezana's victories and his dedication of spoils to God. This trilingual inscription is revealing. It shows Axum's cosmopolitan nature, its use of multiple scripts, and the way religion and politics intertwined. Ezana presented himself as both conqueror and Christian ruler, blessed by heaven to expand his domain. During this golden age, Axum grew wealthy not only from trade but also from tribute. Neighbouring peoples, subdued by military campaigns, paid taxes in cattle, grain, and gold. Control of the ivory trade, in particular, made Axum central to luxury markets in Rome and beyond. Adulis flourished as a port, and its warehouses overflowed with goods from across continents. The architecture of this period reflected Aksum's wealth. Great churches began to rise, some of stone, others of wood. Archaeologists believe the earliest churches followed basilica-style layouts, influenced by Roman designs but adapted to local materials. Inscriptions and crosses carved into stone mark the spread of the new faith. Still, alongside these churches, the great stone stelae of earlier kings continued to dominate the skyline, a reminder that Aksum's identity was layered, not erased. At the same time, Christianity brought new intellectual traditions. Ge'ez, the written language of Aksum, became increasingly tied to scripture and liturgy. Translations of biblical texts into Ge'ez began, creating one of the world's oldest Christian literary traditions. Monks and priests spread across the highlands, establishing monasteries that served as centres of learning, prayer, and preservation of texts. The rhythm of Aksumite life now included the tolling of bells, the chanting of psalms, and the celebration of Christian festivals. Yet Aksum's Christianity was not simply a copy of Rome's. It took on local character, blending with earlier traditions. Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, which traces its roots directly to Ezana's conversion, developed unique liturgies, music, and practices. Even today, in the highlands of Ethiopia, the echoes of Aksum's 4th century conversion can still be heard in the prayers of ancient churches. But the kingdom's golden age was not defined only by religion. It was also a time of political ambition. One of the most dramatic episodes came in the 6th century under King Caleb. By this time, Aksum was powerful enough to project influence across the Red Sea. In southern Arabia, in what is now Yemen, a Jewish king named Yusuf-As'ar, also called Dunuaz, rose to power and persecuted Christians. Appeals for help reached Aksum, and King Caleb responded. Aksumite forces crossed the sea, defeated Dunuas, and established a Christian vassal kingdom in Yemen. For decades, Aksum held sway over parts of Arabia, controlling trade routes and expanding its religious influence. Byzantine sources celebrated this alliance, seeing in Aksum a Christian partner against both paganism and the rising power of Persia. At its height, Aksum was not only a continental power, but an intercontinental one, with authority on both sides of the Red Sea. This era of expansion brought both glory and strain. Maintaining control over distant territories required resources and loyal governors. Trade continued to flow, but competition from Persian merchants and shifting global markets created challenges. Still, for several centuries, Aksum remained one of the great powers of late antiquity, remembered alongside Rome, Persia, and India. Daily life in the golden age of Aksum reflected this blend of prosperity and faith. Farmers continued their work on the terraced highlands, herding cattle and cultivating grain. Markets in Aksum and Adulis bustled with goods. Nobles displayed wealth in carved stone houses, adorned with imported cloth and jewellery. Churches hosted feasts on holy days, bringing communities together. The ordinary rhythms of life were unchanged in their labour, but infused with new meaning through Christianity. And yet, beneath the surface there were hints of fragility. Aksum's prosperity depended heavily on trade routes, which were never fully secure. Its position between great empires meant it was always vulnerable to shifts in global politics. Even as the cross gleamed on its coins and its kings launched campaigns across seas, the seeds of future decline were already sown. Still, in this golden moment, Aksum stood tall. Its rulers presented themselves as Christian kings of a chosen people. Its architecture, coins, and inscriptions broadcast wealth and faith. Its armies marched across seas, its markets linked continents. And so, as you let this chapter of Aksum's story settle, a quiet question arises. How could a kingdom so rich in faith, wealth, and power begin to slip from the world stage only a few centuries later? By the 7th century CE, the kingdom of Aksum had already seen centuries of wealth, faith, and expansion. Its stelae still towered over the highlands, its coins still bore the Christian cross, and its people continued their work in fields, workshops, and markets. Yet, slowly and almost imperceptibly, the rhythm began to change. The very strength that had sustained Aksum, the trade routes, the Red Sea ports, and its position between worlds, became the sources of its vulnerability. The first challenge came from the east. Across the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious and political power was rising. Islam, carried by the Prophet Muhammad and his followers in the early 7th century, transformed the Red Sea world. Within a generation, much of Arabia was united under Muslim rule, and soon the new Islamic caliphates controlled Egypt, North Africa, and the trade routes of the Red Sea. For Aksum, this meant a dramatic shift. At first, relations were not hostile. In fact, one of the earliest episodes in Islamic tradition describes how Muslim refugees, fleeing persecution in Mecca, found shelter in Aksum. The Aksumite king, remembered as the Negus, a title for Ethiopian rulers, granted them protection, refusing to return them to their enemies. This act of hospitality is still recalled with respect in Islamic history. For a time then, Aksum and the early Muslim community coexisted peacefully. But geopolitics rarely remained simple. As Islamic power expanded, control of Red Sea trade routes passed out of Aksumite hands. Ports like Adulis, once bustling with goods from Rome and India, lost their centrality. Merchants now favoured routes through Egypt and the Persian Gulf, bypassing Aksum's highlands. The kingdom's lifeline, its trade wealth, thinned. The environmental strains that had always shadowed Aksum now grew sharper. Evidence suggests that deforestation, soil exhaustion, and perhaps shifts in rainfall reduced agricultural productivity. Terraced fields, once fertile, yielded less. Without strong trade revenues to compensate, shortages became more pressing. The kingdom's ability to sustain large projects, armies, and distant influence dwindled. Political changes added to the decline. As trade wealth contracted, local elites may have asserted more independence, weakening royal authority. The capital itself shifted. By the 8th or 9th centuries, Aksumite kings no longer ruled from the old city of Aksum but from more southerly or inland centres. The great stelae, symbols of eternal power, stood abandoned, their significance fading into silence. Foreign travellers noticed the difference. While earlier Roman and Byzantine writers had described Aksum as a great kingdom, later accounts are scarce. By the time Arab geographers wrote of the region, Aksum was remembered as a faded power, still Christian but no longer commanding trade or armies. The once proud empire had become a shadow of its former self, and yet to call Aksum's end a disappearance is misleading. Though it lost its place in global trade and politics, its cultural and religious legacy endured. Christianity remained strong in the Ethiopian highlands, carried by churches, monasteries, and priests who traced their faith back to Ezana's conversion. Ge'ez, the language of Aksumite inscriptions and scriptures, became the liturgical tongue of Ethiopian Christianity, still used in services today. Legends, too, preserved the memory of Aksum. Ethiopian tradition connects the city of Aksum with the Ark of the Covenant, said to have been brought from Jerusalem by Menelik, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Whether historical or symbolic, such stories rooted Ethiopian identity in the sacred past, linking the kingdom not only to Rome and Byzantium, but to biblical history itself. Aksum, though diminished politically, lived on as a spiritual capital. The endurance of Aksum's legacy is visible in its churches. Some of the oldest still stand in northern Ethiopia, carved from stone or built on ancient foundations. Monasteries founded in the Aksumite age preserved manuscripts, copying biblical texts and commentaries across centuries. In these quiet spaces, where monks prayed and scribes worked, the intellectual inheritance of Aksum was kept alive, even as the wider world forgot its name. Archaeology, too, has revealed continuity. Excavations show that people continued to live in Aksum after its decline, though at reduced scale. Houses and fields remained, even as monumental projects ceased. The city never vanished entirely. It shrank, adapted, and survived in smaller form. When medieval Ethiopian kingdoms rose centuries later, they saw themselves not as new creations, but as heirs to Aksum's Christian tradition. The question, then, is not why Aksum disappeared, but how its identity transformed. What was once a trading empire became a religious heartland. What was once a global power became a regional one. Its kings no longer ruled across seas, but its churches still rang with prayers. And in the slow rhythm of survival, Aksum left a legacy more enduring than trade, a living tradition of faith and culture. For you, listening now, the decline of Aksum offers a reminder of how history moves. Empires rise and fall, trade shifts, climates change. The bustling port of Adulis is now a ruin, its warehouses long empty. The towering stelae lie toppled, their carved windows and doors leading nowhere. And yet in modern Ethiopia, the descendants of Aksum's faith and language continue. The chants of Gayes, the processions of priests, the stories of the Ark, all echo across time, linking the present to the distant past. As you let this final part of Axum's story settle, consider the contrast. Once, Axum stood among the four great powers of the world. Today, it is nearly forgotten in global memory, overshadowed by Rome, Persia, and China. And yet, in its quiet endurance, in its hidden continuity, it may have left a deeper legacy than all. For what is more lasting, the fleeting wealth of ivory and gold, or the steady survival of language, faith, and story across 1,000 years? Story 4. The Kingdom of Kush. The Black Pharaohs of the Nile. When you imagine the Nile River, your thoughts likely drift to Egypt, pyramids against the desert sky, pharaohs ruling from palaces along the floodplains, and temples rising in stone. But farther south, beyond Egypt's first cataract, another kingdom grew in the shadows of the Nile's steady waters. This was Kush, a land both deeply connected to and proudly distinct from its northern neighbour. The story of Kush begins in what is today Sudan, in the region known as Nubia. Here the Nile narrows and bends, cutting through rocky gorges and fertile plains. The land was rich with resources, gold in the hills, iron in the earth, and farmland nourished by the river's floods. For millennia, people farmed along these banks, herding cattle, planting grain, and building villages that would eventually coalesce into powerful chiefdoms. By around 2000 BCE, Egypt already recognized the importance of this southern land. Egyptian inscriptions refer to Nubia as a place of wealth. Its mines glittered with gold, its traders carried ivory and ebony, and its hunters supplied exotic animals for Egyptian temples. Egyptian pharaohs sent armies into Nubia to control its resources, building forts along the Nile and garrisons deep into Kushite territory. For centuries, Nubia existed in this tense relationship, at once conquered and yet always distinct, yielding tribute but never losing its identity. The first great Kushite centre arose at Kerma, near the third cataract of the Nile. Archaeology has revealed a sophisticated city here, with sprawling neighbourhoods, burial mounds larger than some Egyptian pyramids, and evidence of complex social organisation. The people of Kerma traded with Egypt but also resisted it. For centuries, they stood as rivals, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, in the delicate balance of the Nile Valley. Egyptian texts describe campaigns into Kush, often portraying the southern land as a place of wild riches and dangerous peoples. Yet the archaeology tells another story. The Kushites were not simply passive subjects of Egypt. They built their own monuments, crafted pottery of striking design, and forged weapons that rivaled Egyptian arms. In fact, when Egypt weakened during its second intermediate period, Kerma grew strong, pressing northward, even threatening Egyptian towns. Kush, in other words, was not a shadow of Egypt, but a power in its own right. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, however, Egypt regained its strength under the new kingdom. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Thutmose III campaigned deep into Nubia, subduing Kerma and establishing Egyptian rule across the region. For several centuries, Kush became an Egyptian province. Egyptian temples rose in Nubia, Egyptian officials governed its people, and Egyptian gods received offerings on Kushite soil. Inscriptions carved on stone cliffs bear witness to this domination, showing pharaohs smiting enemies and claiming divine, right over the land. And yet, even under Egyptian control, Kushite culture endured. Local traditions blended with Egyptian influence, creating a hybrid society. The people of Kush adopted Egyptian writing and religious imagery, but their own practices remained. They continued to bury their dead in ways that reflected both local and foreign traditions. Their art echoed Egyptian motifs but carried unique stylistic twists. Over time, this fusion laid the groundwork for a culture that was both Egyptianized and distinctly Nubian. When Egypt's power weakened again, the Kushites seized the opportunity. Around 1000 BCE, as the new kingdom declined, Egyptian garrisons withdrew, leaving Nubia independent once more. From this moment, a new phase of Kushite history began, one that would eventually see the Kushites not only reclaim their autonomy, but rise to become rulers of Egypt itself. The first capital of this revived Kushite kingdom lay at Napata, near the Fourth Cataract. Here, beneath the sacred mountain of Jebel Bakal, Kushite kings built temples and palaces, aligning themselves with the great traditions of Egypt while asserting their own authority. Jebel Bakal itself became a symbol of divine power, believed to be the dwelling place of Amun, one of Egypt's most important gods. By claiming this sacred landscape, the Kushite rulers tied their legitimacy to both Nubian traditions and the broader religious currents of the Nile. It was from Napata that the so-called Black Pharaohs would one day emerge. But before they claimed Egypt's throne, the Kushites needed to consolidate their own lands, unify their people, and define what it meant to be Kushite in a world where Egyptian influence lingered like an echo. Daily life in Kush during this period reflected the Nile's steady rhythm. Farmers planted sorghum and barley, herders moved cattle across the plains, and craftsmen forged tools from iron. Kush became one of the earliest regions in Africa to develop large-scale iron production, and this gave it both economic and military strength. Blacksmiths worked in furnaces fueled by charcoal, hammering out weapons and farming implements that would shape the kingdom's prosperity. Trade remained vital. Caravans moved across the desert, linking Kush to sub-Saharan Africa, while Nile boats carried goods north and south. Ivory, gold, incense and animal skins flowed out. In return came luxury items, ideas and technologies from Egypt and beyond. The kingdom sat at a crossroads, and its wealth reflected this position. Yet beyond wealth and trade, identity mattered. The Kushites saw themselves not merely as heirs of Egypt, but as something older and deeper, people rooted in the Nile south of the cataracts, custodians of traditions that stretched back to Kerma and beyond. Their kings built temples with hieroglyphs, yes, but they also developed distinct art, burial practices and royal customs. Their pyramids, smaller and steeper than those of Egypt, reflected their own take on an ancient form, showing how they borrowed from but transformed Egyptian models. As you picture Kush in this time, the Nile winding past sandstone cliffs, temples rising at Napata, and iron furnaces glowing red in the dark, you can sense the strength of a kingdom preparing for greatness. Egypt, weakened and divided, would soon find itself looking south, not at a subject province, but at a rival power ready to claim the pharaoh's crown. And so the question lingers: how did Kush, once subdued by Egypt, rise again to the point where its kings would rule both lands as pharaohs? What transformations, what ambitions, and what faith propelled them from the margins of the Nile Valley to its very centre? By the 8th century BCE, Egypt was a fractured land. Once a great and unified kingdom, it had fallen into decline. Local rulers governed their own regions, and foreign powers pressed on its borders. The great monuments of Thebes and Memphis still stood, but the authority that had raised them was splintered. To the south, however, in Kush, a new force was gathering strength. From their capital at Napata, the Kushite kings built upon centuries of tradition. They worshipped Amun at Jebel Barkal, fashioned themselves as heirs to Egypt's sacred kingship, and cultivated a vision of rule that blended Nubian heritage with Egyptian forms. Their priests, dressed in linen and crowned with feathers, stood before altars inscribed with hieroglyphs, while warriors trained with iron weapons forged in Kushite furnaces. It was here, in this atmosphere of religious devotion and military strength, that a dynasty was born, a dynasty that would not only reclaim Nubia but take Egypt itself. The first great figure in this story was Alara, often considered the founder of the Napatan line. His successors, Kashta and Piye, extended Kushite influence northward, slowly filling the vacuum left by Egypt's weakness. Kashta established control over Upper Egypt, placing his daughter as god's wife of Amun in Thebes, a position that carried immense religious and political power. In this way, Kushite kings did not simply invade, they inserted themselves into the very fabric of Egyptian tradition, claiming legitimacy through the rituals of Amun. It was Piye, however, who made the decisive move. Around 730 BCE, he launched a campaign into Egypt, defeating rival rulers and establishing himself as pharaoh. His victory stela, carved in stone and discovered centuries later, records the events in proud, almost theatrical detail. Piye describes his conquests not just in terms of military might, but as a sacred mission. He presents himself as a devout servant of Amun, chosen by the god to purify Egypt and restore order. In his eyes, the conquest was not an act of ambition, but of piety. Piye's inscription lingers on scenes of ritual as much as on battles. He recounts visiting temples, making offerings and being received by priests who hailed him as king. In doing so, he demonstrates a crucial truth. For the Kushite rulers, conquering Egypt was as much a religious act as a political one. They saw themselves not as outsiders, but as rightful heirs, chosen to revive a land that had lost its way. After Piè's death, his successors carried this project forward. Shabaka, his brother, consolidated Kushite rule, founding what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty. Under Shabaka and his successors, Egypt was united once more, from the delta in the north to Napata in the south. For the first time in centuries, both lands shared one crown, worn by kings from Kush. The image of the Black Pharaohs, Kushite rulers seated on thrones in Memphis, presiding over temples in Thebes, leading armies across the Nile, offers a striking reversal of history. Centuries earlier, Egypt had conquered Nubia, building temples and forts along its southern frontier. Now, the descendants of those once subjugated peoples sat upon Egypt's throne, commanding its officials and armies. The conquered had become the conquerors. Life under the Kushite pharaohs carried both continuity and change. They respected Egyptian traditions, building temples in the familiar style, inscribing hieroglyphs and presenting themselves as upholders of Ma'at, the cosmic order central to Egyptian thought. Yet they also carried elements of their Nubian heritage. Their art, for example, shows kings with distinct Nubian features, and their pyramids, built at Napata and later at Meroe, had steep, narrow profiles, unlike the sprawling monuments of Old Kingdom Egypt. In this way, the 25th dynasty was both Egyptian and Kushite, blending traditions into a new synthesis. The Kushite pharaohs also sought to expand Egypt's influence abroad. They rebuilt temples, patronized priests, and commissioned inscriptions that link them to Egypt's glorious past. Yet they ruled in a turbulent time. To the northeast, a new power was rising, Assyria, with its formidable armies and ambitious kings. The Assyrians saw Egypt as both a rival and a prize, and their campaigns soon brought them into conflict with the Kushite dynasty. Taharqa, perhaps the most famous of the Kushite pharaohs, reigned during this turbulent era. Remembered in both Egyptian records and the Hebrew Bible, Taharqa was a ruler of immense ambition. He fought against the Assyrians in the Levant, supported allies against foreign invaders, and sought to preserve Egypt's independence. Yet despite his efforts, Assyria's military machine proved relentless. By the mid-7th century BCE, Assyrian campaigns pushed into Egypt, defeating Kushite forces and eventually expelling them from Memphis and Thebes. The Kushite dynasty retreated southward, back to Napata. Egypt fell under Assyrian dominance, and later under native dynasties allied with foreign powers. For a time, it seemed the Kushite dream of ruling Egypt had ended, and yet their legacy endured. Even as they withdrew, the memory of their reign lingered, in temples they built, in records they inscribed, and in the stories passed down through generations. For the people of Kush, this was not the end but a transformation. Though they no longer ruled Egypt, they continued to reign over Nubia, maintaining their own traditions and developing their own centres of power. Their pyramids at Napata and later Meroe became symbols of continuity, marking the graves of kings and queens who still saw themselves as heirs of both Kush and Egypt. To you, listening now, the story of the Kushite conquest offers a glimpse of how history bends and reverses. Egypt, so often portrayed as the dominant power, was in this moment humbled, ruled by kings from the south. The image challenges the usual narrative of African history, reminding us that power was never fixed, that the Nile Valley was a space of exchange, conflict, and renewal. As the 25th dynasty receded, one question loomed for the Kushites. How would they reshape their identity now that Egypt was lost? Would they cling to Egyptian traditions, or forge something new, rooted more deeply in Nubian soil? When the Kushite dynasty was expelled from Egypt in the mid-7th century BCE, it could have marked the end of their story. Many powers, once stripped of their foreign conquests, withered into obscurity. But for Kush, retreat was not the same as collapse. Instead, the kingdom turned inward, building a renewed identity south of the cataracts and ushering in one of its most distinctive and enduring eras. The early centuries after Egypt were still anchored in Napata, beneath the holy mountain of Jebel Barkal. Kushite kings continued to see themselves as heirs of Egypt, worshipping Amun and building pyramids that echoed pharaonic tradition. Temples rose, inscriptions were carved, and royal tombs dotted the desert sands. Yet slowly, change began. The weight of Egypt receded, and new rhythms emerged, drawn from the land and traditions of Nubia itself. By around 300 BCE, the capital shifted further south to Meroe, a city near the sixth cataract of the Nile. This move was more than geographic. It signalled a new phase of Kushite civilization. Meroe sat in a fertile region, with access to trade routes linking sub-Saharan Africa to the Nile world. Here, surrounded by forests and iron-rich soil, Kushite culture transformed. Iron became the hallmark of Meroitic Kush. Archaeological excavations have uncovered massive slag heaps, remnants of furnaces where blacksmiths smelted ore and hammered out tools, weapons and ornaments. The scale of production was vast, so much so that Meroe has sometimes been called the Birmingham of Africa, a centre of ironworking that sustained agriculture, warfare and trade. Farmers used iron ploughs to till their fields, warriors wielded iron spears and swords, and merchants carried these goods along caravan routes stretching across the desert. But iron was not the only sign of change. The Meroitic period also saw the rise of a distinctive script. While earlier Kushite rulers had written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, by the 2nd century BCE they developed their own system of writing, now called Meroitic. Though still not fully understood by scholars, the script marked a turn toward independence of thought and identity. The Kushites no longer needed Egyptian forms to record their words, they could inscribe their own. Royal power also took on new forms. Unlike Egypt, where kingship was almost exclusively male, Meroitic Kush elevated queens to extraordinary prominence. These queens, known as Candaces, or Candaces in Greco-Roman texts, ruled in their own right, led armies, and commanded loyalty. In art and inscriptions they appear as imposing figures, sometimes depicted larger than their male counterparts, symbols of strength and authority. One of the most famous Candaces confronted the Romans. In the 1st century BCE, after the Roman conquest of Egypt, Kushite forces clashed with Roman armies along the southern frontier. Strabo, the Greek geographer, records how a one-eyed queen, possibly a Manirenas, led her troops against the Romans, capturing statues of Augustus and resisting Roman expansion. The conflict ended in a treaty that recognized Kush's independence, a remarkable outcome given Rome's usual appetite for conquest. In this moment, Kush stood as one of the few kingdoms to successfully negotiate with the empire on equal footing. Life in Meroe blended the royal and the ordinary. Beyond the palaces and pyramids, ordinary people farmed sorghum, herded cattle, and lived in villages of mud brick houses. Potters produced fine wares with geometric designs, while artisans carved ivory and cast bronze. Temples dedicated to Amun still stood, but alongside them appeared shrines to indigenous deities, reflecting a fusion of beliefs. Festivals, rituals and sacrifices bound the community together, linking the rhythms of farming and trade to the cosmic order upheld by the rulers. The pyramids of Meroe remain some of the most striking symbols of this era. Though smaller and steeper than those of Giza, they multiplied in number, creating a landscape of pointed silhouettes across the desert horizon. Each pyramid marked the burial of a king, queen or noble, filled with treasures, offerings and inscriptions. Over time, more than 200 pyramids were built, turning the sands of Meroe into a necropolis that rivaled Egypt's in scale, if not in size. Today, they stand as silent markers of a civilization that blended continuity with innovation. Yet even as Meroe flourished, challenges loomed. The shifting trade networks that had once sustained Kush began to change. The rise of new powers along the Red Sea and in the Horn of Africa redirected commerce. Caravans that once passed through Nubia found alternate routes. The kingdom's control of the Nile was no longer as central to long-distance trade as it had been in the age of Aksum or later empires. Internal pressures also strained the kingdom. Some scholars suggest that deforestation caused by centuries of iron smelting may have degraded the environment. Others point to political fragmentation, as regional elites asserted more autonomy. By the 4th century CE, Kush was a kingdom of great tradition but waning strength. The final blow came from the east. Around 350 CE, the rising kingdom of Aksum, whose story you have already heard, launched a campaign against Meroe. King Ezana of Aksum, in inscriptions written in Ge'ez, claimed victory over the Kushites. Archaeology supports this, showing signs of conflict and decline around this time. Meroe fell, and with it ended more than 1,000 years of Kushite power. Yet, as with Aksum, decline was not erasure. The legacy of Kush survived in memory, in ruins, and in influence. The pyramids at Meroe still stand today, weathered by wind and sand but unmistakable in their silhouette. The image of the Kandakes lived on in Roman accounts, a reminder of African queens who resisted empire. The Meroitic script, though still only partially deciphered, testifies to a literate culture that valued record-keeping and identity. For modern Sudan, Kush remains a symbol of deep heritage, a reminder that the Nile south of Egypt was not a passive recipient of culture, but an active centre of power. To you, listening now, the story of Kush suggests how civilizations adapt, transform, and endure. First a rival of Egypt, then its conqueror, then an innovator in its own right, Kush never ceased to shape the world around it. The quiet endurance of its pyramids raises a final question. When empires vanish, what remains? Is it the memory of conquest, the iron slag scattered across ancient furnaces, the carvings of queens who defied Rome, or is it simply the steady pulse of the Nile itself flowing past the ruins, carrying traces of all who once lived upon its banks? Story 5. The Kingdom of Benin, Masters of Bronze and City Walls. When you think of walls, you may imagine the Great Wall of China or the stone fortresses of medieval Europe. But in the heart of West Africa, amid dense forests and fertile plains, there once stood another kind of wall, an earthen defence so vast that it rivaled the great works of the ancient world. This was the city of Benin, capital of the Benin Kingdom, a state that grew from small beginnings into one of Africa's most remarkable polities. The Kingdom of Benin emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries CE, though its roots ran far deeper. The people of this land were Edo speakers, farmers, hunters, and traders who lived among the thick forests of the Niger Delta region. Their lives were shaped by the rhythms of tropical climate, rains that fed the soil, rivers that carried canoes, and forests alive with animals and timber. Villages dotted the landscape, bound together by kinship, rituals, and trade networks. At first, power was local and dispersed. Communities were led by chiefs, and authority was often negotiated through councils and elders. Yet, as in many parts of the world, pressures of trade, defense, and prestige pushed societies towards centralization. By the early 2nd millennium CE, the Edo people began to consolidate under a leader known as the Ogizo, or King of the Sky. These early rulers are remembered in oral traditions as semi-mythical figures, bridging the line between history and legend. By around the 12th century, however, the Ogiso dynasty faded, and a new form of leadership arose. The people invited a prince from the neighbouring Yoruba kingdom of Ife to rule over them, establishing a dynasty that would come to be known as the line of the Obas, the kings of Benin. This moment, whether fully historical or partly legendary, reflected both the interconnection of West African societies and the search for stable leadership. With the coming of the Obas, Benin began its steady ascent. The city of Benin itself became the heart of the kingdom. Situated in fertile land, it grew from a cluster of villages into a true urban centre. Houses of clay and thatch lined its avenues, while markets bustled with traders selling yams, peppers, cola nuts, and palm oil. Craftsmen shaped wood, cast brass, and carved ivory. The city's organisation reflected a deep concern for order. Roads were laid out in grids, neighbourhoods were grouped by craft or lineage, and the palace complex rose at the centre, a hub of ritual and authority. But the most astonishing feature of Benin was its walls. Over centuries, rulers and citizens constructed an immense system of earthen ramparts and moats, known today as the Benin Walls. Built not of stone but of packed earth, they extended for thousands of kilometres, encircling both the capital and surrounding villages. Archaeologists estimate that more earth was moved in the making of the Benin Walls than in the Great Pyramid of Giza. These defences were not only practical, protecting against raids, but symbolic, statements of unity, permanence, and the power of the Oba. Life in Benin revolved around cycles of agriculture and ceremony. Farmers cultivated yams, maize, and cassava. while hunters brought bushmeat and fish to the markets. Craftsmen formed guilds, each specialising in their art: ivory carvers, brass casters, wood sculptors, and leather workers. These guilds were tied directly to the palace, producing works for the Oba and his court. In this way, art was not merely decorative but central to governance, binding artisans and rulers in a network of mutual obligation. Religion infused daily life. The people of Benin worshipped a pantheon of deities connected to natural forces: earth, rivers, fertility, and ancestors. Rituals were performed at household shrines and public altars alike. The Oba himself was regarded as a divine figure, the intermediary between the human and spiritual realms. His authority rested not only on political power, but on sacred legitimacy. Festivals reinforced this bond, with dances, drumming, and sacrifices marking the passage of seasons and the renewal of kingship. The influence of If, Benin's Yoruba neighbour, was also profound. If was famous for its terracotta and brass artistry, and it seems that Benin drew inspiration from its techniques. Oral traditions describe how an artist named Igwega, brought from If, taught Benin's craftsmen the lost wax method of brass casting, a technique that would later make Benin world-renowned. Whether legend or fact, the connection between If and Benin reflects the circulation of ideas and skills across West Africa. As Benin grew, its kings consolidated power. The palace expanded, a labyrinth of courtyards, halls, and shrines. The Oba presided over ceremonies, judgments, and councils, his word carrying both temporal and divine weight. Chiefs managed affairs of the city and countryside, while soldiers defended the kingdom from raids or waged campaigns of expansion. Tribute flowed inward, whether in food, cloth, or symbolic gifts. Yet despite this growing centralization, Benin remained deeply rooted in community. Villages outside the capital maintained local leaders, who balanced obedience to the Oba with their own traditions. Festivals united urban and rural populations, and the great markets brought together people from across the region. The kingdom was not a monolith imposed from above, but a layered society, where power and obligation flowed in multiple directions. The 15th century marked a turning point. Benin's influence extended further afield, reaching neighbouring states and commanding trade networks. At the same time, new forces from beyond Africa's shores began to appear, Portuguese ships arriving along the West African coast in search of gold, pepper, and allies. The first contacts between Benin and Portugal were cautious, shaped by diplomacy and curiosity. In time, however, they would reshape the trajectory of the kingdom. But before the arrival of Europeans, Benin had already established itself as a formidable polity, a city of walls, a people of guilds, and a kingship both sacred and worldly. Its foundations were deep, rooted in the soil of the Edo-speaking world, and in the imagination of ancestors who had transformed scattered villages into a city that impressed even outsiders. As you let this image settle, a forest kingdom of earth walls, of markets filled with yam and pepper, of artisans hammering brass in courtyards, consider the quiet strength of Benin in its early centuries. It was not yet the empire it would become, nor had it yet faced the disruptions of the wider world. It was rather a society consolidating itself, testing its institutions and laying the groundwork for a legacy in art and architecture that would endure for centuries. And the question that lingers is this: how did Benin, from these forested beginnings, grow into a kingdom so powerful that Europeans marvelled at its order, its walls, and its art? By the 15th century, the kingdom of Benin had entered its golden age. The foundations laid in earlier centuries, its city walls, artisan guilds, and sacred kingship, were now harnessed to the vision of a line of Obas who sought to expand the kingdom's power and prestige. The forest kingdom became not merely a city with walls, but an empire with influence stretching across rivers, trade routes, and coastlines. The central figure in this transformation was Oba Ewa the Great, who reigned in the mid-15th century. His reign was remembered as a watershed, a time when Benin's political structure, art, and rituals took on their mature form. Ewa strengthened the monarchy, consolidating authority over chiefs who had often balanced or resisted the king's power. Under his rule, the palace became the heart of a centralized state, and the title of Oba acquired a sacred aura unlike any before. Ewa also reorganized the city. Streets were straightened and widened, neighbourhoods were realigned, and the palace complex was rebuilt into a vast structure of courtyards, ceremonial halls, and shrines. Each space had its role, some for judicial hearings, others for ancestral rites, still others for state councils. Travellers who visited later would remark on the orderliness of Benin streets, comparing them to the avenues of European cities. Military power was equally crucial. Iwa extended Benin's reach, waging campaigns into neighbouring territories and securing tributary relationships with surrounding communities. Soldiers, armed with spears, bows, and later imported firearms, carried the Oba's authority outward. These campaigns were not only about conquest but also about securing trade routes, access to resources, and symbolic dominance. The city of Benin became both a capital and a hub of tribute, with goods and captives flowing into its markets. It was during this period that Benin became increasingly renowned for its artistry. The lost wax casting technique, which artisans had perfected, was used to create brass plaques, heads, and figures of extraordinary detail. These works adorned the palace, telling the kingdom's history in metal. Each plaque depicted scenes of obas, warriors, courtiers, and rituals, creating a visual archive of Benin's grandeur. To walk through the palace was to be surrounded by history made tangible in brass. Ivory carving also flourished. Carved tusks, delicate and intricate, displayed scenes of mythology, kingship, and daily life. Ivory salt cellars and spoons were produced for both domestic use and, increasingly, for trade with foreigners. The ivory gleamed, a reminder of both the forest's bounty and the skill of Benin's artisans. Into this flourishing world came the Portuguese, their sails first appearing off the West African coast in the late 15th century. Portugal, in its age of discovery, sought allies, trade goods, and pathways to Asia. Its ships sailed along the coasts of Guinea, Ghana, and Nigeria, making cautious contact with coastal polities. By the 1480s, they had reached the region of Benin. The first encounters between Benin and Portugal were marked by mutual curiosity. Portuguese traders were impressed by the order of Benin City, its broad streets, and its formidable palace. They noted the walls and moats, remarking that they exceeded many works they had seen in Europe. They described the Oba as a powerful monarch, treated with reverence by his people, and ruling over a city that seemed both sophisticated and well organised. The Oba in turn was intrigued by the goods the Portuguese brought: copper and brass, which artisans valued, cloth and beads, which signified prestige, and eventually firearms, which offered new possibilities in warfare. From Benin's side, the Portuguese sought ivory, pepper, palm oil, and, increasingly, enslaved people. At first, the slave trade played only a limited role in Benin's dealings with Europeans. The kingdom had its own internal forms of servitude, tied to war captives and household labour. But European demand for enslaved Africans grew steadily, and coastal states were drawn into this commerce. Benin engaged in the trade selectively, careful not to undermine its own social fabric or to empower rivals. For the Portuguese, Benin offered not only goods but diplomatic partnership. Oba Esiji, who ruled in the early 16th century, sent envoys to Portugal, and some of his sons were baptized as Christians. A few Benin nobles even travelled to Lisbon, where they were received at the royal court. These exchanges illustrate a period when African kingdoms and European states dealt with one another as peers, negotiating alliances and exchanges. Esiji also made use of Portuguese military support. With the aid of firearms and mercenaries, he waged campaigns that secured Benin's dominance over rival towns. At the same time, he reinforced the authority of the Oba by reshaping rituals and strengthening links between the monarchy and the artisan guilds. Under Esiji, the brass casters produced some of their finest works, capturing the likeness of the king and his courtiers in immortal form. Daily life in Benin during this golden age was marked by both tradition and change. Farmers continued to cultivate yams and cassava, women managed markets, and artisans worked in their courtyards. But new influences appeared. Portuguese goods, such as coral beads, became prized symbols of rank. Firearms, though rare, added a new dimension to warfare, and the very presence of foreign visitors in the city offered a glimpse of a world beyond the forests. Religion remained central. The Oba was still regarded as semi-divine, and rituals honouring ancestors, deities and spirits continued unabated. But Christianity made its appearance too, brought by Portuguese priests. A small church was built in Benin City, and some elites experimented with the new faith. Yet Christianity never displaced traditional religion, which remained the foundation of political and spiritual life. The kingdom's expansion was not limitless. Geography placed constraints on Benin's reach. To the north lay powerful states like Oyo and Nupe. To the east, the Igbo and other communities. To the west, Yoruba kingdoms with their own ambitions. Benin's strength lay in its ability to balance expansion with diplomacy, securing alliances while maintaining internal order. By the 17th century, Benin's cautious approach to the Atlantic trade distinguished it from some of its neighbours. While coastal states became heavily reliant on the sale of enslaved people, Benin limited its participation, preferring to trade in goods like ivory and pepper. This decision may have preserved its internal stability but also limited its access to European weapons and wealth. Still, to outsiders, Benin remained a wonder. European visitors wrote of its wide streets, as broad as the streets of Lisbon, of its market squares filled with goods, of its artisans casting bronze with unmatched skill. They marvelled at the palace, with its courtyards decorated by plaques, each one a record of history in metal relief. Few African cities impressed outsiders more deeply than Benin, and yet, beneath the grandeur, tensions simmered. The demands of tribute weighed heavily on subject communities. The rise of the Atlantic slave trade posed difficult choices about morality, survival, and power. And as European interest deepened, the balance of exchange began to shift. What had begun as partnership and mutual curiosity threatened to become entanglement and dependency. As you reflect on this golden age, picture the streets of Benin, straight and orderly, lined with clay houses, echoing with the sound of drums and market calls. Imagine the palace walls gleaming with brass plaques, each one whispering of kings and wars. And imagine Portuguese sailors, wide-eyed, stepping into a city that overturned their assumptions of what Africa could be. The question that lingers is this: if Benin had managed to thrive by balancing tradition with cautious exchange, how would it weather the coming centuries, when European demands for enslaved labour grew insatiable, and when global tides of trade and conflict began to reshape entire continents? The Kingdom of Benin entered the 17th century as a respected and orderly state, known throughout West Africa for its artistry and governance, and admired by Europeans for its architecture and ceremonial life. Its rulers, the Obas, had skillfully managed relationships with foreign traders, neither surrendering autonomy nor plunging too deeply into dependency. Yet the same caution that preserved Benin's internal stability also carried risks. As the Atlantic world transformed, with slavery fueling economies across Europe and the Americas, kingdoms that embraced the trade gained weapons and wealth at a staggering pace. Benin, by comparison, chose a more restrained path, and the consequences of this restraint became clear over time. The slave trade was the great shadow over the early modern centuries. Portuguese, Dutch, English and French ships crowded the Gulf of Guinea, bargaining with coastal rulers for captives. Inland wars increased, fueled by the demand for human lives. States like Dahomey, to Benin's west, became heavily involved in supplying enslaved people, gaining access to European firearms in exchange. This altered the balance of power across the region. Benin did engage in the trade, but never at the scale of its neighbours. Oral traditions and European reports suggest that Benin's rulers restricted slave sales, perhaps out of concern for destabilising their own society. Instead, they continued to emphasise trade in ivory, pepper, cloth, and beads. Yet by avoiding full engagement in the slave economy, Benin limited its access to European firearms. Over time, this choice left the kingdom militarily vulnerable, in a region increasingly shaped by gunpowder and external alliances. Internally, Benin also faced strains. Tribute obligations placed heavy burdens on outlying communities, sparking occasional revolts. Succession disputes tested the unity of the royal court, as chiefs and palace officials manoeuvred for influence. While the monarchy remained revered, the complex web of guilds, councils and rituals sometimes pulled in competing directions. Still, Benin endured. Travellers in the 17th and 18th centuries continued to marvel at the city. The streets were still broad and orderly, lined with houses whose walls were polished with red earth to gleam in the sun. The palace remained immense, filled with courtyards decorated by brass plaques that recorded generations of rulers and warriors. Markets bustled, filled with women selling yams, peppers, dried fish, and cloth. Artisans still hammered brass and carved ivory, producing objects that were both sacred and utilitarian. But by the 19th century, the world around Benin had changed irrevocably. The Atlantic slave trade began to decline under European pressure, replaced by a growing demand for palm oil, a commodity vital to industrial lubricants and soap production. Once again, European traders turned to West Africa, pressing for commerce on their own terms. Benin resisted, determined to maintain its control over trade routes and to preserve the sanctity of its markets. This resistance increasingly brought Benin into conflict with Britain, the new global power in the region. British merchants, backed by their government, sought unrestricted access to palm oil and other goods. Benin's rulers, following centuries of tradition, insisted on controlling who could trade, when, and under what conditions. To the British, this looked like obstruction. To Benin, it was simply sovereignty. Tensions escalated in the late 19th century. In 1892, a British envoy attempted to secure a treaty with Benin that would effectively open its markets to foreign control. The Oba at the time, Ovonramwen Nogbaisi, hesitated, signing under pressure but never intending to enforce the agreement in a way that undermined his authority. By 1897, matters reached a breaking point. A British delegation set out to Benin City, officially on a mission of diplomacy, but in reality to force compliance. Benin's chiefs, wary of the intentions, ambushed the party outside the city, killing several members. For Britain, this became the pretext for a full-scale invasion. The punitive expedition of 1897 was swift and brutal. Thousands of British troops equipped with modern rifles, artillery and machine guns marched on Benin. The defenders, armed mostly with spears, bows and a handful of outdated firearms, could not withstand the assault. The city was captured, the palace burned, and its treasures looted. The British carted away thousands of brass plaques, ivory carvings and other artworks, the famous Benin bronzes, which were dispersed to museums and private collections across Europe. Oba Ovonramwen was captured and exiled, dying far from the city he once ruled. The kingdom was annexed into the British colony of Nigeria. The walls, once the pride of Benin, were left in ruins, and the palace, once filled with art and ritual, became an empty shell. And yet, even in conquest, Benin's legacy endured. The looted bronzes, though torn from their original context, astonished European audiences. They revealed a level of artistic sophistication that many outsiders had not imagined possible in Africa, challenging racist stereotypes and forcing a reconsideration of African history. To this day, the Benin bronzes remain among the most celebrated works of African art, and debates over their restitution to Nigeria continue. Within Nigeria itself, the memory of Benin lived on. The Edo people maintained their traditions, and the title of Oba survived as a cultural and spiritual institution even under colonial rule. Festivals continued, honouring ancestors and gods, and the descendants of artisans preserved the techniques of bronze casting and ivory carving. To walk in Benin City today is to sense both continuity and loss. The earthworks of the Great Walls can still be traced, winding through neighbourhoods and forests, though much eroded. The palace has been rebuilt in modern form, serving as a reminder of past grandeur. The people of Edo State continue to tell the stories of their Obas, of Ewara, Esiji, and Ovonramwen, linking present life to centuries of history. The story of Benin, then, is not only one of rise and fall, but also of endurance. A kingdom that once impressed Portuguese sailors, defied British merchants, and left behind walls greater than pyramids has never vanished entirely. Its art still speaks across time, its traditions persist, and its name remains a symbol of dignity and resilience. As you let this chapter rest in your mind, imagine the final days of Benin's independence, the city streets tense, the palace filled with ritual before the coming storm, the walls looming as guardians one last time, and then imagine the silence after the invasion, broken only by the clatter of foreign soldiers carrying away centuries of memory cast in brass. And the thought that lingers is this: when you see a Benin bronze today in a European museum gleaming under glass, what do you see? The artistry of a people, or the echo of a kingdom taken by force but never entirely erased.